Hi there, I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. According to a commentary by Michael Sutton in the Japan Times, Europe is founded by the Germans, run by the French, broken by the Greeks, deserted by the British. Everyone hates the Turks and ignores the Italians. There is no Europe. It is a myth. Strong words indeed. But after the Brexit vote taken 6 weeks ago, and with the emerging crisis in EU-Turkey relations, following the failed coup attempt and the resulting purge of President Erdogan's opposition, in what direction is Europe likely to be heading? To help find a path through this complex of problems besetting Europe, I'm happy to be joined by Fraser Cameron, Director of the EU Asia Centre in Brussels. But first, let's take a look at this.
A post-Brexit Europe. In the past 4 weeks, the world has been watching the new British Prime Minister Theresa May to see where she's leading the country.
Brexit means Brexit.
What further influences will this departure bring to the EU? What form will Britain's new relationship with the EU take? And with China, Hinkley Point C is in doubt after the British government delayed its approval. What are May's main concerns, and how will it impact on UK-China relations? Entangled by the controversial migrant deal between Turkey and the EU, Merkel has warned that Europe must not be blackmailed over the refugee crisis. After the failed coup attempt in Ankara, the EU's attitude towards Turkey's bid for membership hardened.
Until now, we haven't received the backing and the statements that we, the whole of Turkey, expect from these countries.
What has changed in their bilateral relationship? Moscow and Ankara want to normalise relations. So is Turkey turning its back on Europe and making stronger overtures to Russia?
Welcome to Dialogue, sir. Let's begin with a question on the future of granting Turkey the badly needed visa-free travel to European countries. Is it possible?
It is possible, but it's not going to happen very quickly because there are a number of conditions that Turkey has to fulfill, and at the moment it's going backwards because of what's happening in Turkey. So the principle has been accepted, but the conditions will take some time to be fulfilled, probably several months at the earliest.
What about prospects of this migrant deal between European Union and Turkey? Because that was negotiated personally by Angela Merkel. It seems that Angela Merkel is angry and refuses to be held hostage or blackmailed by this issue. To what degree do you think this deal will fall apart?
I don't think it will fall apart. I think both sides have got too much riding on it. Turkey wants the money, wants the prospect of visa-free travel for its citizens, and Europe needs Turkey to do its part.
How much is needed?
It needs it a lot in terms of the Turkish economy has been affected by the coup, by the sanctions that Russia imposed, and the general downturn in the global economy. So Turkey definitely needs the money from the EU.
And it also accepted a lot of refugees already.
Turkey has not accepted that many refugees itself. I mean, it is basically at war with Syria, and it is also finding it very difficult to deal with the insurgency of the Kurds inside its own country. So it's fighting a war basically on two fronts, and that's why he mended fences with Putin, Erdogan. He didn't want a war on three fronts.
It would appear that apart from trying to find a solution to the Syrian refugee crisis, Europe doesn't appear particularly keen to get involved with Turkey. So you sound a little bit pessimistic about the future of having Turkey as a full member state of the European Union, right?
This is an issue that has been at the center of European politics for 4 decades now, when Turkey first applied, and there's still, I would say, no realistic prospect of Turkey becoming a member in the next 5 or 10 years. But Turkey is an important geostrategic player. It's an important industrial country for the EU as well, big trade opportunity. So there will continue to be close trading relations, economic relations, some political cooperation, but membership is far away.
Let's look at what's happening in Germany. Angela Merkel was the woman of last year by Time magazine for her bravery to give a bear hug to thousands of refugees, and the number could be 1 million in Germany alone. She may have underestimated the rebound of ultra-nationalism as a result of so many asylum-seeking people in her country. Do you think the the CDU will fall apart? And what do you think of the resilience of her politics and leadership?
No, I think there's no chance of the CDU falling apart. I think she will be re-elected Chancellor next year. There is some opposition within the party, but it's not that serious. The alternative to Angela Merkel is on the right wing, Alternative for Deutschland. They may just scrape into the Bundestag next year. They need a minimum 5% of the vote. But what's remarkable about Germany is how little damage it's actually done to the political and economic system. They have absorbed these refugees, dealt with the latest round of terror attacks carried out by isolated young men, and carried on regardless. So I think chapeau to Germany. They've done exceptionally well.
The massive arrests in Turkey, do you think this will further fuel the anger and uneasiness of European politicians about membership of Turkey? Do you think what happened in Turkey is a kind of a safeguarding democracy, or in the aftermath of the failed coup, what happened there is actually the alleged dictatorship? It seems Europeans are quite confused at this moment.
I think everyone's confused about what's going on in Turkey. On the one hand, you've got a democratically elected government with Erdogan as president, and therefore he's a constitutional right to govern. At the same time, many people, I think, would say he overreacted after the coup in terms of the numbers of people he's arrested, preventing academics from leaving the country, arresting a couple of thousand of judges, etc. That really has gone down very badly in Europe, and that, of course, is one reason why visa liberalization would be delayed yet again. So there are very few voices saying that Erdogan has done the right thing following the coup. People supported him right after the coup, but they also want him to get back onto a more democratic path.
But why do you think thousands of Turks turned out and took to the street to support the crackdown upon the failed coup? There are two allegations. One says, look, this is a show of solidarity between the opposition party and the ruling party. The other is a picture about the immediate jubilation against whatever military moves in the streets.
Well, I think obviously Turkey is a very divided country. You see that from the last elections between government and opposition. But I think there was overwhelming majority of people wanted to demonstrate against the military coup. There have been several military coups in the recent history of Turkey, so they didn't want another one. And what I think was quite remarkable was the power of social media. Erdogan actually used a cell phone that beamed onto television to get people out onto the streets. Quite remarkable.
One crisis after another besets Europe. Let's go back to Brexit and the aftermath. What's going on?
Well, there are a multitude of problems. It's proving a very testing time for the EU, but the EU is not going to fall apart. I mean, the EU is fundamentally a political project with France and Germany at the core. These countries still believe that Europe matters to them, and they will hold it together at all costs. Now, we have perhaps lost the UK. It's not absolutely certain yet. They've still not even put in Article 50 to start the negotiation for exit process. They may come to a point when they say, well, actually it's better staying in than the deal we're going to get by going outside. There might be another referendum. This has happened before in Ireland, in other countries too, so we have to wait and see. But it is a testing time, but it's a testing time for many other countries in the world too, who are all going through similar reactions to the impact of globalization.
And do you think departure from continental Europe will benefit the UK financially?
No, I think most experts are pretty certain there will be an economic downturn, at least in the short term, for the UK. In the longer term, if Britain does not have access to the single market, which is its biggest market on its doorstep, this will have implications for development too. It's a mirage to think that you can go off and sign free trade agreements with China, India, or even the United States. I mean, this will take many, many years to do.
But this Brexit has enabled London to take back its border, its legislation, and all other things that they have missed for so long.
Well, the City of London was not particularly damaged by anything the EU was doing. In fact, it benefited from what's called passporting, namely allowing British banks to operate and other banks based in London to operate right throughout Europe. So that was a big plus for the banking sector in London. If they lose that, then it's going to be quite damaging, and the financial sector makes up 15% of the British economy, so that's a really important aspect.
Many observers point out that there has been devastating and ruthless personnel reshuffle in the British cabinet. That's why Prime Minister May is described by the local media as ruthless in the reorganization of the cabinet. And how damaging is that? Or do you think it's contrarily a very constructive approach to review whatever policies that the Prime Minister David Cameron adopted previously?
Well, it's been a Shakespearean drama in British politics during the past month, with blood all over the stage as people are stabbed in the back and then they emerged into new positions again. I think she was always a quiet favourite. She had been a Remain person but not spoken out too much enthusiastically during the campaign. So you have a Remain Prime Minister, but she's put in 3 prominent Brexiteers to positions where they will have to take responsibility for negotiating Brexit. And if that doesn't work to the satisfaction that they hope, then they will be the one that can be blamed for this and not her. So she's a very clever politician.
Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan has told the BBC that Britain has the upper hand in Brexit negotiations, insisting that the country is going global, while Europe is suffering a devastating decline. Is it necessary, according to his analysis, that Europe needs to undergo some kind of reform to strengthen its solidarity and the ability to facilitate the process of negotiations on the migrant crisis?
Well, Europe is undergoing reforms. It's, for example, in the process of establishing a banking union, which will be quite a dramatic step forward. It's also, I think, largely resolved the migration crisis so far. We can wait and see what happens this summer, but the numbers are drastically down from last year. In terms of the British negotiating position, well, what counts in today's world is size. And are you, as an actor of 60 million people, going to get as good a deal as one operating through 500 million people? I don't think so. So I think the Brits are going to find it very tough. Plus, they have absolutely no trade negotiators. Trade has been something that the European Commission has done for the last 40 years, not any individual member state, so they simply don't have the personnel to actually start negotiating these deals.
A lot of second thoughts, a lot of reviews are taking place in Great Britain at this moment. Is there any chance for Britain to have any backslide on the referendum?
There's certainly the possibility of having a second referendum when the terms of a deal are finally worked out. Theresa May could say, look, we've done our best. This is a deal on offer. I want you to decide. Do you want this deal, which I personally cannot really recommend to you? But we have an option of going back to the status quo and staying in. And I think the evidence shows that many people would actually welcome a second chance to vote.
You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Fraser Cameron, Director of the EU Asia Centre in Brussels. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back. What do you think of the impact of Brexit upon the Hinkley Point?
I don't think Brexit itself had any impact on Hinkley Point. It's the fact that Theresa May has now taken over as Prime Minister, and she's concerned about the politics, the economics, and the security of it. I think on the security side it's perhaps overblown, thinking that somehow with Chinese involvement they could somehow control the future of British energy. I think that's rather far-fetched. The economic side is, I think, a bigger argument because the technology is unproven. We've been asked to sign a cheque for £25 billion to set up a nuclear reactor that nobody knows if it's going to work, and at a cost to the British taxpayer 4 times more than we are paying at the moment. So it's not actually a very good deal for the British taxpayer at the moment. So that's why I think she's having a second look at this.
But the Chinese are very concerned as to the consequences arising from a possible cancellation of Hinkley Point. Is that a reflection of a protectionism or national security?
I think it's a different set of team players now. David Cameron and above all George Osborne were very enthusiastic about the closer relationship with China, talked about the golden age. Remember when they gave the red carpet to President Xi when he visited London 18 months ago. Well, they have gone. It's a new Prime Minister, a new Chancellor, and they are taking a second look. It doesn't mean to say that they will finally decide to cancel the project, but they really want to review it and assess all the implications. And I think that's probably right in the circumstances that they do this. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a more protectionist Britain.
Any other major policy issues that need to be reviewed by the new team in Downing Street?
Well, another important infrastructure project in which China is likely to be involved is the HR2, the high-speed railway that was going to be built between London and the north. There's a lot of opposition to this because it's simply going to cut about 30 minutes from the journey time, and people think this huge amount of money could be better spent on improving roads and other infrastructure.
Do you think the European Union is in real danger of, disintegration? We discussed this at the beginning, but similar calls have been made in other countries.
Yes, but there's no real demand. Inevitably, there have been some popular voices in the countries you mentioned asking for a referendum, but there's no real popular enthusiasm, and certainly no government is prepared to go down this track. So I certainly don't anticipate there being any other in-out referendum in any country in the EU in the foreseeable future.
Let's look at the young members of the European Union. The more Eurosceptic Visegrad countries like Hungary, Poland, Slovakia and the Czech Republic are the most organized bloc. Quote, we have to return to the thesis that the member states and not EU institutions form the basis of the EU. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has said, that's his quotation, the EU is not in Brussels but in the 27 capitals. What do you think?
But this is quite true. I mean, decisions are taken every day of the week by the 28 member states meeting in Brussels in the council formation, but they all have to agree the legislation. So it's nonsense to say that somehow we've got to return to a system of the member states taking decisions. That's exactly what happens now. The system works by the European Commission putting forward legislative proposals, but then both the Council, that is all the member states, plus the European Parliament have to decide.
Michael Sutton, writing for the Japan Times, has said that Britain has a global empire more powerful and influential than any other in the modern world. Now it is condemned for withdrawing from a transitory, illusory organization fraught with seismic internal contradictions and inconsistencies. The European Union, for example, Europe is the past. Europe is racked by demographic decline and economic irrelevance. What do you think of this note of pessimism?
Well, people have been trying to write off the European Union for many years, and it's still in existence. It's still the largest trade bloc in the world. It's still the largest GDP in the world. It's still the largest provider of development assistance, technical assistance. It's still the major player in practically all international agreements like climate change to Iran. So it's not irrelevant. It's not an actor like the United States or even China. It's quite confusing to often even to journalists who write about it, but it's there to stay, has some temporary problems, but I've no doubt it will overcome these problems and become even stronger in future.
The British Parliament refused to send British troops to Syria and get involved in the civil strife. Germans have also been very cautious in any military intervention in the volatile region of the Middle East. Having said this, what do you think of the campaign pledges or whims of presidential hopeful Donald Trump, which drew fire immediately from the Democrats, that the United States would refuse to protect and maintain its leadership in NATO should the Europeans and other allies of NATO refuse to share the responsibility, namely the military budget. How likely is this to happen?
Well, it depends first if Donald Trump becomes president, which I think many people would be skeptical about. Secondly, it would mean him doing in the White House what he said on the campaign trail, and of course we know from history politicians say one thing on a campaign and another thing when they're in office. But thirdly, I think it's already quite damaging even to raise this suggestion that NATO is a question simply of budgets. It's actually a question of sharing democratic values, similar interests, standing up to Russia, particularly important for the Baltic states. So I think it was really bad for Trump to make these remarks, and it was roundly condemned by just about every leader in all NATO countries.
Britain has long been a very close and special ally of the United States, starting from perhaps the war on Iraq back in 2003. With the departure of the UK from European Union, do you think the the German-Franco axis will be highlighted and featured prominently? And do you think this will reinforce the transatlantic relationship in the context of how to deal with Vladimir Putin, President of Russia?
I think with Brexit, it's going to highlight the importance of Germany as the most important power in Europe, and this is something that Washington, already basically accepts. Secondly, if they can reach agreement on a number of core issues, France and Germany will be the tandem again driving Europe forward. But at the moment, they have rather diverging views on economic issues in particular. And thirdly, I think the Eurozone countries will come closer together. So you've got, Germany and France, and then the Eurozone. These sort of three pillars are going to form the basis for the future of the EU, including the relationship with the United States.
Shortly before the failed coup, President Erdogan was able to mend fences with Moscow, and right after foiling the coup, he promised to visit Moscow very quickly. What's happening?
Well, firstly, I think the sanctions were hurting the Turkish economy. They were used to vast numbers of quite rich Russians coming to the tourist resorts, and they stayed away. I think, too, they recognized that they did not want to have an ongoing conflict with Russia, given the security problems they have both at home and to the south with Syria. So they wanted an excuse to mend fences with Russia. Similarly, they've mended fences with Israel after a long spell of bad relations. So I think it was not unexpected that Erdogan took this initiative and Putin reciprocated.
What do you think of the conspiracy that European intelligence organizations as well as the CIA had both been involved in a failed coup? Because the Turks said they would never ever believe in anyone else. After the coup, they said that Islamic cleric Gulen, who seeks shelter in the United States, may have been assisted by overseas intelligence organizations. CIA could be one of the candidates in the accusation of the Turkish government.
CIA is usually brought up when any coup comes along, but I honestly think that in terms of America supporting Gulen, what's in it for them? I mean, they had a reliable ally in Erdogan. There were certainly some problems, but in terms of security issues, providing a platform for the US to bomb ISIS targets in Syria, that was going on. So I don't really think there's any evidence that the United States wanted to get rid of him, nor did any other European country.
President Erdogan is currently wedged between Europe and Asia. He could go to Moscow, he could also get close to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And that will wreak havoc perhaps with NATO. And Turkey has long been a very strong member of the NATO. What do you think of the consequences should tangible evidence be discovered about the association between the alleged association between the CIA or European intelligence organizations in helping with the coup?
Well, that's a big step to follow through on these allegations. But even if you look at Turkey's geopolitical situation and look at Turkey's economic and trade interests, it's overwhelming with Europe. They trade 60% plus with the EU. Their trade with the Shanghai Cooperation countries is about 10-15%, so it's not really an alternative for them. They're well established in Central Asia. They have some business there. They have good connections via Turkish Airlines there. It's one of the best networks to reach there. But the idea that Turkey is going to somehow desert NATO and go off and build a new alliance with Russia, China, or anyone else is an illusion. I mean, Turkey will remain firmly inside the NATO camp.
When we look at the future of the Middle East, particularly political fallout arising from the Arab Spring, do you think Turkey is a good role model, is a controversial one, or you are still probing in uncertainty, in the darkness of uncertainty about what pilot programs can be singled out from developments in the Middle East so that democracy or a secular governance could be resumed or exercised in the Middle East?
Well, many people had hoped that Turkey would provide a model as a democratic secular government. I mean, equally many people were looking to countries in Asia, like Indonesia, for example, Malaysia, as examples of multi-religious faiths living peacefully with each other, which could be applied also in the Middle East. With Turkey now, I think we have to wait and see what happens over the coming weeks and months. It's certainly been a shock to many people, firstly the coup and then the aftermath of the coup. But it certainly has made the situation in the Middle East more complicated, and finding a solution to Syria even more complicated now. So I think we have the prospect, being rather pessimistic here, of a very long, ongoing conflict in Syria and in neighboring countries for many years to come. There's no quick solution.
Are you saying that the civil strife it takes years, perhaps, for the civil strife in Syria to come to an end, without perhaps the important help from Turkey?
Yes, I mean, if you look at a similar conflict to Europe in the Middle Ages, we had a 30 years war, religiously based, which went on until both sides were exhausted, and then they finally made a peace. It's not inconceivable that we would have a similar 30 years war in Syria.
One more question concerning the issue of terrorism that has gripped continental Europe for so many weeks. Is it a big issue? Do you think the haunting spectre is looming larger in continental Europe? And do you think this will seriously fuel the rise of far-right movement in France, Germany, and other countries that certainly would reject accepting any refugees from the Middle East?
Well, it's not. There's no direct link between refugees and terrorism. Many terrorists are homegrown terrorists, if you like. There's no magic bullet. There's no 100% solution to terrorism anywhere. It's been with us for all time. Terrorism. It's nothing particularly new. It's captured more headlines recently because there have been a number of pretty horrible incidents. But it is important to keep things in perspective. There are more people killed each week in road accidents than are killed by terrorists. But of course, when a terrorist strikes, it captures the headlines and people get worried. So this makes politicians react. But you have to recognize that you have to basically keep your life going on. In the 1970s, Britain was confronted with a major terrorist campaign by the IRA, but they never shut down shops, they never shut down cinemas, they never shut down railway stations. They simply kept going. And that is the best way to defeat terrorism. Keep going, ensuring that your police and security services have the best sort of methods, well-resourced to actually deal with the problem. But there is no 100% solution.
Thank you very much, Fraser, for being with us. We really appreciate the insightful comments. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.